Testing. Okay. All right, good afternoon, Commissioners. Miranda Thompson with Mead and Hunt. I am the project manager for this Ukiah Municipal Airport Land Use Compatibility Plan update. And with me today is Ken Brody, a senior planner who has been involved with this planning efforts from its inception. And the last time we were in front of you was in April of this year, and at that meeting we provided you with an overview of the project and outlined our scope and schedule for the project. Since then, we have had several meetings with the technical advisory group that we've established to help guide this planning effort, and we come to you today to provide you with an update. So in this presentation today, I will give you a brief overview of the compatibility plan and the overall approach that we're taking in developing the updated plan. Out of our technical advisory group meetings, we have some information to present and get some feedback from you on the draft compatibility zones as well as the criteria. Then we will talk about the schedule moving forward to complete the project. In terms of the ALUCP overview, the whole premise of this update is to update the plan that was adopted by this commission in 1996. Since then, there has been a new statewide ALUC guidebook that has been released, which is the California Airport Land Use Planning Handbook. That guidebook or handbook is published by the Caltrans Division of Aeronautics and is a tool used by airport land use commissions to prepare, update, and adopt compatibility plans, such as this one. The project is also intended to reflect the new airport layout plan that the city adopted in 2016. Some of the proposals in the airport layout plan are not reflected in the 1996 compatibility plan. So it's important for us to update the compatibility plan to reflect both the handbook and the new airport layout plan. The approach that we are taking with this project is to have the current or the new airport land use compatibility plan be consistent with the guidance provided in the state handbook. We are also looking to reflect existing and future airport operations, as well as getting feedback by the key stakeholders, which include the ALUC members as well as county and city representatives. In our overall schedule, we also have a couple of touch points with the public where we're inviting them to provide comments on the updated plan when it's released. As I mentioned, we've held 3 technical advisory group meetings, and we're at a point where we have drafted some compatibility zones that would replace what's in effect today, as well as update the compatibility criteria. So we'll walk through those materials today. The county distributed a package that essentially I've provided a snapshot in the PowerPoint presentation with the details in your handout, which includes an annotated presentation outline and several maps with the draft zones that are under consideration by the technical advisory group. And again, we're looking for some feedback from the commission. The first one is map 1, again in your handout, and it has a zoomed in version for you. And this reflects the handbook safety zones, which have been adjusted to reflect the aircraft operations, the primary traffic patterns, the runway protection zones reflected in the airport layout plan, as well as information from the users of this airport and the airport manager. The key focus here is the blue lines, which are the draft compatibility zones that are supported by us the consultants are recommending this set of zones, and it's supported by both the county and the city. Again, all of the compatibility zones reflect the safety zones from the handbook. Zone 1 has been adjusted to reflect the runway protection zones in the FAA-approved airport layout plan. To the south, you'll notice the zones that are offset by about 5 degrees to reflect a traffic pattern, the primary traffic pattern that aligns with Highway 101 to the south, as a way of avoiding the high terrain west of 101. We are also looking at a city-urban overlay in zones 3 and 4 to the north, which would affect the city of Ukiah. That's to reflect two things: the existing land use patterns that exist within zones 3 and 4, as well as the density exceptions provided in the 1996 compatibility plan for Ukiah in terms of infill development. To the south, we're also considering a county urban overlay zone that would apply in zone 3 to the southwest. It would not apply to zone 3 to the southeast or zone 4. The second map reflects some variations to what I just presented, and these points have been brought up during our technical advisory group. One is an adjustment to Zone 1, and what we're terming as the blended runway protection zones, and that would apply to the north. The compatibility zones reflect an existing runway as well as a future runway extension, and the blended zones I'll get into in the next couple of slides, where we can zoom into the runway protection zones. But this tag variation, where we have not yet reached consensus, but it was brought up during the technical advisory group meeting, and therefore we would like your input on this today, is a blended runway protection zone, or Zone 1. The other variation is to the south, where there is no offset of zones 2, 3, and 4, meaning that the zones provided in the handbook are applied as without any adjustments. The other variation is to not allow an urban overlay zone in zones 3 and 4. This is a comparison map that shows the consultants' recommended zones in blue with the handbook safety zones in red, and that is what we're calling as the tag option or tag variation. And we've identified the 4 key focus areas. So focus area 1 is regarding the runway protection zones. That's at the runway 15 end. Focus area 2 is the southern compatibility zones, south of runway 33. We have the urban overlay zone for the city, as well as the focus area 4, which is the county's urban overlay zone. So here's map 4, which zooms into these areas of interest. If you look at the image on the left side of your screen, you'll see the runway protection zones, and the blended RPZ is shown as a yellow dashed line that essentially connects the 2 corners of the existing and future runway protection zones. And so that sliver of area would be included in Zone 1, where I should say at this point there would be greater restrictions, which we'll get into in a little bit.
Could you outline that for me? I mean, with your pointer.
Right here. There's, it's hard to see on this image, but on your printed map, there's a yellow dashed line that connects the corners of
Right.
the runway protection zones on either side, and it would increase restrictions beyond that provided in the runway for just the runway protection zones as shown in the ALP, the airport layout plan. So that's one focus area. The other is the city urban overlay for the cities area, which would be zones 3 and zone 4. And again, we'll talk about the criteria in a little bit, but the intent of the city urban overlay zone is to reflect the existing density pattern within those established areas, as well as reflect the density provided in the current compatibility plan. At the south end of runway 33, you can see the offset of the safety zones. So the consultant recommended zones are shown in blue. And what we've done is align those with Highway 101. If we apply the handbook zones with an assumed straight in, straight out, extended runway center line, those zones are represented in the red color. The other focus area is what we're calling the county urban overlay zone, and that would apply just within zone 3. Let me find my mouse here. And it depends on what variation you're looking at, but it would either apply within this narrow band within the blue, or it would apply within this red band here, zone 3. So those are the variations that we bring forward to you for some input. The next is, so the zone boundaries is only one piece of the puzzle. The second is what criteria would apply within each of those zones. And that's the discussion we'll have now. You have an expanded version of the table at the back of your packet. The first set of columns reflect the criteria from the handbook. The second set of columns is pulled from the 1996 compatibility plan. For the version on my screen, I've gone through and color-coded A, B, B2, C, and D zones so that we can easily reference it back to the current compatibility zone map. Then in the last 3 set of columns is the consultant recommended zones. What I'd like to have you focus on is zone A, or in this case for what we're now terming as zone 1, which is the runway protection zones. In the current compatibility plan, it prohibits residential development, but allows some non-residential development with a density or intensity of up to 10 people per acre. The handbook really wants to preclude any development within the runway protection zones and has an intensity of 0. We are recommending that same set of criteria apply to the updated plan. So there would be no development within zone 1. The other area of interest is B2. B2 has a density restriction of 2 acres, 2-acre lots, and allows 60 people per acre. Within B2, there's an exception provided in the current plan that allows within the city of Ukiah infill development that would, with an intensity or density of up to 28 dwelling units per acre, and also provides an allowance for non-residential development of 90 people per acre. The last area that I would like to point your attention to is Zone C, which you'll see on the map as the yellow areas. Within that zone, the current plan allows 15 dwelling units per acre and up to 150 people per acre. So keep that in the back of your mind as I move forward through some of the comparisons of the criteria. And the next slide, though, I'd like to talk about the urban overlay zone within the city limits. So again, just knowing that there has been, it allows infill development of up to 28 dwelling units per acre, and then within Zone C, 15 dwelling units per acre. This data was provided to us by the city, which identifies some of the residential neighborhoods within zones B2 and C. And this middle column here identifies the density of those developments. So we're looking at about 15 dwelling units per acre, all the way up to almost 35 dwelling units per acre within Zone C. Now, this is important because I'm going to go back to the other table. What we're proposing is that within Zone 3, we would allow up to 15 dwelling units per acre, which is consistent with what is allowed in the current plan for Zone C.
It would be helpful for me if you had the map,
The map?
colored map at the same time you're talking.
Okay.
Can you split the screen?
I can go to this next image, which is an overlay.
Thank you.
Okay. So this table just shows in very simple terms where there are increases in the restrictions. The minus represents where there's a reduction, where the criteria is less restrictive. NC is no change. And then the UO is urban overlay. The red hatched area identifies where restrictions will be increased. You'll notice the easy one is there is an area lateral of the runway where it was excluded from excluded from the current compatibility zones. But as part of if we apply the handbook safety zones, this area would be captured. If we scroll into, or if we zoom into Zone 1, what we're seeing here is that in Zone A, as I mentioned, it allows up to 10 people per acre. The new criteria would say no intensity allowed within Zone 1. So that's why it's hatched as red as an increase in restriction. There's no change in residential because both the current plan and the handbook and what we're proposing precludes or prohibits residential development within Zone 1. The other area is the pink. Any pink, which is B2, that you find in Zone 2, which is right here, this rectangle, so you can see at the north end. Let me get my notes now. Do you have your notes? Okay, so there's an increase in restrictions in terms of both density and intensity. So it's affecting residential and non-residential development because the current plan allows up to 28 dwelling units per acre within the pink areas. The current plan would reduce that to 10-acre parcels. In terms of intensity, we're looking at 90 people per acre down to 60. Let me say at this point in time that the discussions we've been having in the technical advisory group meeting is that the most critical areas are off the ends of the runway. So zones 1 and 2 are the areas where we would typically want to see greater restrictions, and the areas moving away from the extended runway center line, so lateral of the runway, off the, beyond Zone 2. So we're looking at zones 3 and 4 and 6. That's where there's some flexibility that could be considered. Okay, so, and both the city and county have, and as well as the commissioners, have generally supported that concept of needing greater restrictions right off the end of the runway. As we get into the Zone 3, similar situation. The current plan allows 28 dwelling units per acre. It would be reduced down to 2-acre lots unless we allow the urban overlay, and this is one of the areas where we're considering an urban overlay, and that would reflect the 15 dwelling units per acre. And even there's still some restrictions, but the city acknowledges that that's the situation. As we move into Zone 4, again, the pink area, we're seeing a decrease without an urban overlay. With an urban overlay, it would go from 28 dwelling units per acre under the current plan up to 35 dwelling units per acre within an urban overlay zone. So what the city is losing in Zone 2, they could possibly recoup in Zone 4 with an urban overlay. Moving down to the yellow areas, Zone C. So we're looking at the yellow within Zone 2. So that's primarily up in this little corner of Zone 2 within the city of Ukiah. Again, the current plan allows 15 dwelling units per acre. It would go down to 10-acre lots. And then for non-residential, it's 150 people per acre down to 60 people per acre. In Zone 3, that's these little pie wedges here. So the current plan allows 15 dwelling units per acre. Without an urban overlay zone, it would go down to 2-acre lots. With an urban overlay zone, we would also reflect the 15 dwelling units per acre, so it would be a wash here. It's consistent with the current plan within this pie wedge, the yellow. Moving to Zone 4 up here in the yellow area, it would be 15 dwelling units per acre down to 2-acre lots without the urban overlay, and 35 dwelling units per acre would be allowed with an urban overlay. The next area is Zone D, which is the green. And within Zone 3 up here, we would see some restrictions here. What's the NL? No limit. So it goes from no limit in Zone D, which was the green, and now it would be down to 2 acres without an urban overlay zone or 15 acres with the urban overlay zone. Lastly, to the west, we have just simply that this would now be excluded from any density or non-residential intensity restrictions, but there would be a real estate disclosure requirement still applicable within this green area on this side. This is the higher terrain area. The traffic pattern is on the east side of the airport. And then I talked about how this additional area would be captured. No restrictions for residential, but there would be some intensity restrictions for non-residential development, consistent with the handbook, which allows up to 300 people per acre. I realize there's a lot of information provided during that overview, but I think the key takeaway here is that the red hatch symbols here identify where there's going to be some restrictions greater than what's in place today. The urban overlay zone provides some flexibility there, for example, for the jurisdictions, and we've tried to match the densities allowed under the current plan and or what exists today, and that is based on the information that the city provided us in this table here. Their density ranges from 15 up to 35 as the max. And I'm going to ask Ken to weigh in on some.
One, I just wanted to, again, reiterate Miranda's point about the most important areas being the Zone 1 and to some degree Zone 3 off the ends of the runway. And what really becomes evident as we put this map together, you can see where restrictions are added into those key areas, which is really our focus. The other point I wanted to make is the distinction between this proposed set of zones and the colored existing ones, in that they are very much focused on aeronautical factors. They come directly out of the handbook guidance, as opposed to the currently adopted plan, which, while it also has aeronautically driven, most of the zones were then modified to follow roads and other geographic features. The map outline, as you see here with the red boundaries, the lines fall wherever they may fall across various parcels. So there would be a variety of parcels that would be in more than one zone. But it reflects where the aircraft are flying, thus the offset to the south, which is also consistent with the guidance that the handbook provides. So I just wanted to emphasize that those 2 points in terms of how this differs from the currently adopted plan.
And thank you, Ken. So to wrap up our presentation, and we'll entertain questions from the commission. This shows where we are today. We received the notice to proceed with this project in early February. We met with you in April. We've had 3 technical advisory group meetings over the summer. And here we are today presenting the draft compatibility zones and criteria. And we have received comments from the city, county, and then the members of the commission who sit on the technical advisory group. But we present this information to you to get your feedback and input, as this will be considered in development of the draft compatibility plan, which we intend to bring forward to the commission in January. In December, I should say that here we are in November. In December, we are proposing, or we are going to a joint city-county planning commission meeting to present essentially the same presentation, talking about the compatibility zones and criteria to inform that body. And then we'll come forward to the commission in January with a draft plan that will be the formal, that will start the clock for the formal public review period of the plan and the associated CEQA document, with an anticipated approval date, hopefully in February. Oh, and this, in talking with the city, we're recommending that once the ALUC reviews the draft, or we bring the draft plan to the commission in January, then we would hold the joint county-city meeting with the elected bodies after we present the draft plan to the commission. That makes more sense from a planning standpoint. As this is an advisory group, then we bring it to the commission, then we take it to the elected officials to inform them of what the draft plan contains, and then with a potential approval by the commission in February of 2020. So with that, we are here to answer questions.
Anything else from county staff?
Thank you. So Julia Acker-Krog, and what I handed out to you folks that you found on your desk when you came in was just a little map showing the zoning districts that are south of the airport that are in the unincorporated zone. There's not, a lot of this plan is really focused in the incorporated city limits, where much of the discussion has been focused today, but there are some areas that fall within these boundaries, and I don't know if you could back up to the slide that shows the restriction zones. That one there, perfect. So in that 3 zone that Miranda's highlighting right there, that's the one area within the unincorporated area that we're hoping to see an urban overlay zone. And that's really would allow up to 15 dwelling units per acre within that area. And that's primarily based upon the existing zonings that exist in that area, as well as some of previously entitled projects that are really at the point of recording maps and getting ready to break ground. So county staff is recommending solely doing the urban overlay on that side where Miranda's highlighting, and then the 3 zone on the opposite side, on the east side, we would not be requesting an urban overlay in that area because it is agricultural zoning and really isn't there's not increased density within that zone. Within the 3 zone that's shown there for the urban overlay, we have zoning districts, which is what I provided you, of R1, R3, and SR. And those allow in the R1 district up to 7 dwelling units per acre. In the R3 district, up to 29 dwelling units per acre, and in the SR district, also up to 29 dwelling units per acre. So this would still be limiting it to 15 dwelling units per acre, but staff is recommending and hopes the commission agrees with staff's recommendation to allow an urban overlay for that just one side of the airport.
And that's in addition to the 5-degree rotation of...
That would be with the rotation as well of how the zones lay, primarily, and that I believe is also supported, and I'll look to our experts over here, by handbook regulations where the approach zone, it really makes sense to locate it a little bit to the east, so that way it lines up more with Highway 101 and also avoids some of the terrain that's as you start going up 253.
I take it that the area, the 3 on the west side is restricted by the hills? Is that why it's narrower than the 3 on the...
I can answer that question. It's because the primary traffic pattern is on the east side of the airport, and the handbook allows an adjustment to the compatibility zones, or at least zone 3, to reflect a one-sided traffic pattern. It does allow, the handbook, I should say, does allow for adjustments of the zones to reflect the predominant traffic pattern, and that's the reason, that's what's driving the blue zones. In fact, when we were driving up here today, we saw someone taking off from runway 15, and sure enough, they're aligning with 101. They're just skirting the highway, again, trying to keep away from the high terrain.
You indicated that adjustment was a result of conversation with airport manager. Airport manager's here. Could we hear directly from you on that point?
I'm Greg Owen, Airport Manager for City of Ukiah. Yeah, that was early on in our discussions when we laid out the traffic patterns. That was how the traffic patterns do lay out. So typically all aircraft do stay to the east side of the airport. So that was how we came up with that determination. And our noise procedure does actually have aircraft, when they take off from 15, do a turn to that, towards 101.
East.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any questions from the commission at this time before they fleet away in our memory?
I had, so just in kind of a general sense, the request is basically in the cross-hatched area with these overlays. It's really basically looking at less density zoning. Am I correct for future, when we look at these, the red crosshatch, right? We're kind of trying to protect that doesn't get more developed. Is that correct?
In zones 1 and 2, we are
Right.
adding greater restrictions. In zones 3 and 4, we are recommending an urban overlay zone to reflect existing densities as well as the densities allowed under the current plan.
Right. Okay.
Any other questions from the commission at this time before I open it up to public comment? Hearing none. Any public comment on this item?
Good afternoon. My name is Joe Thomas, and I just had a couple questions here, mainly for Miranda and Ken. This first question might be a little premature. I'm not sure how far you guys are along in the actual, the entire club update. How will the updated club address pre-existing incompatible land use? And I'm thinking kind of more specifically in the future Zone 1 area. And then my next question also had to do with the boundaries of the proposed Zone 1. What's the reasoning for using the future RPZ when, according to the 2016 airport layout plan, there really hasn't been any studies that show that this future runway extension is feasible? And mainly, I think it's the obstruction at Hastings Avenue. Just those two questions.
Please.
Happy to answer those questions. So the first one was related to how the compatibility plan will affect existing incompatible land uses, particularly in Zone 1. The LUC does not have any authority to make or to require a change to an existing land use. So if it's a residential dwelling, let's say, within Zone 1, which prohibits residential, the LUC has no course of action to require that dwelling be demolished. However, if that property owner was interested in making a change to the parcel, and let's say wanted to have 2 dwelling units, split the parcel up, then it would be subject to the compatibility plan. So any new proposal for a project that would require a discretionary review at the local level, for example, it's requiring a zone change, that would trigger a review by the LUC in conformance with the new compatibility criteria. In terms of the runway protection zones, the airport layout plan does show an existing and future scenario. This airport layout plan has been approved by the FAA as well as the city. Per state law, the LUC must reflect the existing and future conditions of an airport when it develops an airport compatibility plan. Because this is an FAA-approved, city-approved airport layout plan, we are showing what's shown in that document, and that's reflected here as an existing and future, or I should say, it's reflected here as a future extension. The gentleman is correct that in order to get the runway extension approved for construction by the FAA, it will require a justification, a need that a tenant or a user has, that perhaps they're flying a larger jet, they need that additional runway length, and that would support an extension of the runway. And the last one was that it? Okay.
Does that address your question?
Hi, Joe Thomas again. Yes, mostly. The big question was Hastings. Based on that, and I'm not a pilot, but I did study that ALP, and it's got that. I think it's the PAR 77 plane, and it shows all the obstructions coming through, whether it's the existing runway or the future runway. And it seemed to me that the future runway wasn't feasible, mainly because Hastings Road was in the way. Second, there was something like 48 trees that had to be cut or removed that protruded into that PAR 77 for the future runway. And then also, it was something like 14 power poles, which would basically have to be moved underground to keep that area clear for the future runway. Thanks.
I knew I was forgetting one thing. Okay, so in terms of the runway, essentially, what has happened is that the runway end has been relocated, and that's what you see here in this aerial photo. And the runway, this location here is based on the airspace clearances required. The airport layout plan, which is this drawing down here at the bottom of the slide, what it's saying is, or what it's showing is that the marking here would continue to be the landing threshold. So an aircraft arriving to land on runway 15 would land at this point or any point after that landing threshold. The existing pavement, what the hope is that this existing pavement can be recaptured and the runway end relocated to provide the necessary clearance for FAA requirements. It's called a runway object free area, and that is bumping up against Hastings. And it would allow the airport to capture a couple hundred feet of existing pavement. The new runway end, or the future runway end, is not set based on the threshold sighting surface. It's based on the object-free area. The threshold sighting surface or the airspace clearance requirements are driving where this marking is, and that is not intended to change. We're just trying to capture some additional pavement at the end of the runway for departures to the south.
Any other comments from the public, questions?
Hi, I'm Bill Garton from Garton Tractor. When you look at this picture, we're right to the left of the runway and up, I believe, off Talmadge, right there. So that falls in Area 1, I suppose?
A portion of Zone 1, or the runway protection zone.
And what's the restriction as far as people on that zone?
We would propose, to be consistent with the handbook, 0
0.
within the runway protection zone.
Okay. So we have a business there now, so do we move?
Similar to what the gentleman's first question is, the updated compatibility plan does not affect existing land uses, even if they're considered incompatible with the new criteria, unless the property owner is interested in changing the use of the property.
Could you have the same use and put like a 1,400 square foot building on that property?
Miranda, I think it'd be helpful if you go look at where that we have, I think, an image of how the RPZs are looking in that area, because that was one of the topics of discussion, was about whether or not blending it. And you can see then the property there, and there's a portion of the parcel for Garton Tractor that would remain outside of that RPZ area and be in Zone 2, whereas you would still have a portion that was in Zone 1.
Yes, basically, and this was the topic back when the city met on your project. If you take just directly the 2 RPZs straight from the airport layout plan, where you had contemplated putting a new building was not in either one of the RPZs. If you connect the 2 corners like that orange line would suggest, then a portion of your building would be within that, what would become Zone 1.
Where are we at there? Where's our building at, right there?
That's your existing, and
Oh,
where
okay.
you were proposed is right where Miranda's showing the cursor, and that orange line would kind of go right through where you were in your last design, where your building would have been located.
So that's bad? We can't build a building then, right?
If that orange line, the blended RPZ as we've discussed, if that is the line that the commission adopts, then that building would not be permissible. If you follow the green, blue colored line, which is the boundaries of the RPZ, then you're just outside in terms of the building, and you would be in Zone 2, and based on the usage criteria, in terms of the number of people, it would appear to be consistent.
Yeah, and what's the number of people again? It said 0 for 1. It was 2.
So for 2, it's 60 people per acre.
But we just have a sliver in 2, so what happens? You just say you have,
You would look at how many people and what the acreage is within the Zone 2.
is that a building there? It's hard for me to look at this. Is that the building there? Is that
That's
it?
your existing building, yes.
That's right there.
You're right on the line.
Julia
That's the
Acker-Krog,
existing buildings on the line.
I think it's important to remember that it doesn't affect your existing use that you have there.
Yeah.
This only affects future use that you would like to, future uses and buildings that you'd like to put on this site.
But the building, I think, is to the right of the yellow then, isn't it? Brad, do you know?
The
Hard for
yellow
me to
line
s-
runs right through the existing building.
But the other one was to the right of that,
The
wasn't it?
green,
If you wouldn't mind coming up to the mic so we can catch you on there.
I'm sorry.
Thank you.
hog it. So,
Sir, could you please state your name for the record?
Brad Campbell, General Manager, Garten Tractor, Ukiah. So the yellow line of the fused, or whatever you're calling it, runs right through our existing building. If you did move forward with those blended zones, that basically kills Garten Tractor, Ukiah. We would not be able to put up our new building, which was just outside of the RPZ green line. The building that we were moving forward with. So yeah, the yellow line kills Garten Tractor, Ukiah.
Does it go right to the-
Sorry, what I mean by that, it does not allow us to expand and
Right.
build our shop, which the agricultural industry in this area needs greatly. So that's what I mean by that. It doesn't kill anybody, but it doesn't allow us to keep up with existing and future business.
Eric, I have a question.
Yeah.
That kind of gets back to, in some of these areas, when we have, the line change, so to speak, to protect the runway and its uses of the airport. What happens in this case? Do we have something in here as like a takings? What happens to property owners? Other airports, when they've expanded or did, boundary line adjustments to meet the new regs. I just, are there other findings that, the neighboring property owners might want to know about? What happened in the past to other municipalities with their airports meeting new regs for all the reasons we know why that happens, to protect existing property owners? What happens? I mean, it would be good at some point, because that's going to happen. That discussion's going to come forward more as we get farther in this presentation down the road. And it would be good to see what other, plans did with those neighborhoods and property owners.
Now, to the first part of your question, again, reiterating Miranda's point, is that under the statutes, the LUC has no authority over existing land uses. So there wouldn't be any takings in that sense, because any existing use could continue forward. In terms of the potential for development or expansion, yes, this would, the LUC plans in general do add restrictions.
Right.
In many areas of most airports. It falls under the same type of regulatory capabilities as what any zoning separate from airports would do. Sometimes there are added restrictions that must be met. We typically, in compatibility plans and the preliminary drafts we're putting together of policies for this plan, and we've been focusing very much on the maps and the criteria here, but for other policies, we usually allow for circumstances. Sometimes there's unique situations that come up, you know, that we either would address ahead of time, as is the case with the concept of the urban overlay, where we recognize that there's a lot of existing development as well as proposed within the area to the north that reflects the established pattern of land uses, and therefore we are suggesting that higher densities and intensities be allowed in those areas. Again, that follows the concepts of the Caltrans handbook, that you look at what the established land use patterns are as one of the factors in developing the criteria. I don't know if that completely answers your question, but that trying to at least focus on key parts of it.
I think I'll try to chime in here too. So I think I'll use the example which you're very familiar with of like coastal zone restrictions, sensitive habitat area criteria, restrictions and standards within zoning ordinances or general plans or coastal elements that limit your ability to be able to conduct a certain activity on the site. Anytime you're doing a plan or establishing new zoning regulations, there's always that potential that you may be limiting uses. That's why we go through a public hearing process, accept comment as well, but it's part of doing land use planning.
Two things, points of clarification. What's currently allowed to be built in Zone A, which is where Garton's currently located, under the current rule?
Under the current plan?
Yeah.
So it says prohibit residential, and, well, let me just, I have a slide here, let me just, for the benefit of the group here. So this is the table from the current 1996 compatibility plan. So it says 0 residential, 10 people per acre. All remaining land should be kept for open land. And then it says, I have some additional notes here. It says all structures except set by aeronautical function, assemblages of people, objects exceeding Part 77 height limits, hazards to flight are prohibited.
So currently A zone, no buildings.
Correct.
Okay. Second, the current layout is that wherever a line goes across the property, it is assumed that the less restrictive overlay permeates that whole parcel. So if you had this is the current rule.
Yeah.
And under the new, that changes to?
We treat each portion of a parcel that falls within the boundary as though it were independent of each other. So if a parcel is split by Zone 1 and Zone 2, the portion within Zone 1 could not have any structures unless it served an aeronautical function, and the portion within Zone 2 could be developed consistent with the criteria.
So in this particular case, there's a reduction in restriction. In the case of Garden, currently nothing could be built on the parcel because A zone is totally limiting, but with the proposed new rule, you have a Zone 1 and a Zone 2 that's on the parcel, so some portion of the property is buildable. So it is a reduction in restriction.
Correct.
Let me add to that, yeah, there's a reduction in restriction of what's going to be in Zone B, the way I understand it. That's why Zone B is so important to our business continuing to be there. So let me be real clear on what a good compromise for Garten Tractor looks like. And that is, we're okay with a non-blended zone. Soon as you blend the zones, we're done for the over dramatization that I mentioned earlier. It doesn't allow us to expand. So if you don't blend the zones, we're fine. And then at that point, we're in Zone B. Our project is compatible with, both plans are compatible. Allows us to go back before the city council. And with a 2/3 vote, which is what we got last time, our project moves forward. Obviously, if we're not going to be consistent with the plans, we're not going to go back before the council because we need a 4/5. And Doug Crane and Steve Scalmanini are never, we're never going to get one of them. So that's what a win looks like, or a compromise for Garten Tractors. Don't blend the RPZs. Allow us that little sliver of property to build the shop so my mechanics can work safely and keep up with the workload. And yeah, the density increases, like Eric said, which is good for us also. So that's what a good compromise looks like for Garten Tractor. Don't blend the zones.
Bill Garten again. So what happens if, Zone 1, you have 0 population there, right? We move. What happens to the Ruddock family? They have this property. They rent it again. Well, you can have 2 people in Zone 2, but everybody else is 0 in this part of it. I mean, do you do a force condemn it and pay them $2 million or whatever it's worth and go on with life and wipe it out? I mean, how does that work? Because it becomes useless as as investment property, and the use changes. What happens? Do you condemn it and pay them the money, knock it down, plant some flowers?
Is it a taking?
So through the chair, Deputy County Counsel Matthew Kudrowski, I think we're getting a little too hyper-specific about one particular property. Today is
Well, it's
looking for...
concerned us. We have people employed.
Sir, I
Sir,
understand.
we have a lot of people employed, but they're concerned about
Understood.
their future.
In terms of the
So
agendizing of the item, we're looking to the ALUC and the public for any comments on these maps. And at a certain point, we're crossing over into discussing a particular project that may come before boards and commissions in the future.
Yeah, which we've discussed about 4 years or whatever. I mean,
So that being
but
said, my
I'll-
advice to the chair would be trying to get off, if there's other discussion the commission wants to have on it, but I would recommend
Let's
trying
just
to...
get the zone clear. The procedure is 0 people, Zone 1, 10 people, Zone 2, right? Or 60. And if your lot's split, you would probably prorate what acres are in Zone 2 for the people. So you have a half acre Zone 2? Is that how it works?
Not gonna do that.
I can't speak to your specific parcel, but I will say that what we're showing here in the red hatch, it represents the runway protection zones without the blended RPZ. Within that red hatched area, it would preclude any future development within that zone unless it's aeronautical based. Anything outside of that zone would be available for development consistent with the compatibility criteria, which allows up to 60 people per acre.
Okay, thank you.
Any other comments from the public?
Good afternoon, Commission. Craig Schlutter, Community Development Director for the City of Ukiah. And thank you for hearing this item today. I wanted to speak a little bit about really the purpose for the city's involvement in, participating in the update of this plan. Really, we have 2 primary reasons. One is we're trying to protect the airport interests as well as the development interests. So that's always like kind of a fine balance. But we think it's possible with the updating of this plan. And the second is that really, to that second point, the purpose is to bring this 96 plan into compliance with current standards. So we have the 2011 handbook We have existing airport regulations. We're trying to bring it into compliance with those current regulations in the handbook. From that standpoint, I wanted to be more specific about the city's position related to the various options that you have in front of you. So number one, it's a little confusing, I think, from the way this is kind of laid out here. But it does say on number B, it says tag compatibility zone option map 2. And that suggests that the entire tag supported that option, or a consensus of the tag supported that option, and that is actually not the case. Most of the consensus on these different recommendations was on number 1. So the recommended compatibility zones was what a majority of the tag members felt should be proceeded with. And just to be even more specific with that, the city does not support the concept of blended RPZs. We support the urban overlays as outlined here. We support zones 2 through 4 offset on the southern portion of the runway. And really, again, I'm going to just kind of go back to the first point I made. The reason we support all of this is because it's based on existing aeronautical functionality. We're not supporting anything that is not really based on that. The traffic pattern on the southern part of the runway supports the 5-degree offset. The existing land uses that are in our major residential areas support the urban overlays. So I just wanted to make sure you understood our position. Thank you.
Not gonna say anything, I'm just grabbing my notes.
Anything else from the public? Closing public comment, back to the...
Excuse me, Chair Crane. Joe Thomas again. Sorry to beat this dead. I still have a question about this future RPZ. So Miranda, you mentioned that the added asphalt, on runway 15, is that strictly for taking off, heading to the south? Or is that also for planes taking off, heading north?
It can only be used for departures to the south.
To the south. So if that's the case, why is the future RPZ larger on the north side if planes aren't going to be taking off that way, if they're only taking off to the south? That's really the issue that Garton and I have. It's not so much the current RPZ, it's the future RPZ that encroaches into our properties, which is why we're so concerned about it. Thank you.
I might clarify a little bit there. There's a couple of ways that can happen at the north. As the airport layout plan is currently drawn, for aircraft landing from the north, they land where the displaced threshold is, and that would be the case in the future as well. For aircraft taking off to the south, they would have that additional amount of pavement. As far as going in the opposite direction, it can be handled in a couple of different ways. One is to consider where the displaced threshold is to be the operational end of the runway for aircraft taking off toward the north or landing toward the north. As the airport layout plan is currently drawn, that's not the case. That whole amount of pavement technically would be considered part of the usable runway for operations toward the north. It gets into what's called declared distances that the FAA does not usually like to see happen with general aviation airports. So that would be something that if and when this project were to go forward, the city and the FAA and probably Caltrans would all get involved in that. But at this point, as the airport layout plan is drawn and the data in it shows, that full length would be available for operations to the north.
I guess, so Julia Acker-Krog, one thing that we've talked about in the TAG meeting groups is really about the airport layout plan informing how this document goes forward. And things shown in the current airport layout plan must be included in looking at this update that's being done here. So if in the future the city adopts a new airport layout plan, then there would be the opportunity for these items to change. If it's determined that this future RPZ and runway extension is infeasible and it gets removed out of the airport layout plan, then foreseeably we'd come back and amend this document to correct that so that that future RPZ would not extend so far. And I mean, correct me if I'm wrong on that, but I believe that's what we've talked about.
That's correct.
Back to the commission. How's everybody feeling about the various thoughts?
I was wondering how it works for funding, like from the FAA. If you don't go with what Caltrans recommends and all that, I know I've heard before where if your airport's not to what they require, then they don't help fund it.
True.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on specific items here in terms of direction that the commission would like to steer? The tag brought several concepts for consideration, maps for discussion, or produced or aided in the production of. Are there any elements here that there's general consensus on that we can get behind?
Chair Crane, would you like for us to lay out what those items are again that
I
we're
think you got 'em
seeking
listed.
direction from?
You got them listed here in
Okay.
Mead and Hunt's. We'll start with, I think, the easiest one. Urban overlay to the north. Is there general consensus that there should be an increased density allowed under the plan for the north end?
Which one are you reading from?
Compatibility zone, this is the Mead Hunt. Compatibility zone, item 2B, tag zone option map. Looking at item, oh, wait, no. Sorry.
I think you're under A4 underneath there.
City urban overlay. Zone 3 and Zone 4 to the north. Density increased to reflect existing residential densities. The blanket plan from Caltrans is substantially more restrictive than what we're seeing in the north end. And this, as we've been told by staff, is the overlay would bring it closer to in line with what's in use and what's currently allowed. So it's actually higher levels than that are currently happening.
Right, but is it less restrictive than the other? So it's a little more restrictive because we're needing that in the sense of looking at current regulations and if you're looking at the runway. The question I had is, if I may, so is the city of Ukiah, the planner from the city of Ukiah, could you come up to the mic? I have a question or two for you. Are you comfortable with what's being presented for the overlays that are being presented and the small, some of the hatched areas and I would like to hear a little more from your perspective.
Sure. I think where I started with my statement was we are looking at this plan as meeting the standards in the handbook and aeronautical function. So if anyone knows me and knows kind of my history over the last 3 years, you know that I'm very interested in assisting the city in creating housing. We have the urban overlay to allow that flexibility to produce more residential units. Is the 2 zone, is that going to allow us to produce as much housing as possible? Probably not. But the overarching consideration here for us is we have to get to a plan that's in full compliance with Caltrans standards. And so that, regardless of how we professionally may feel about creating more housing in this situation, we will be able to create it in other zones, we feel. So we're going to opt for supporting this recommendation.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
So is there general consensus for the urban overlay at the north end? Any discussion on that particular topic?
I think it's practical for what we're looking at here, is it's already currently there, so there's no reason not to look for that.
What is staff looking for from us on this? Item by item, or?
Deputy County Counsel Matthew Kudrowski, I've been thinking about that as we're talking. So this is agendized as a presentation from Mead and Hunt, and I think it's clear that all agenda items always have public comment. So we're reviewing what the presentation is, what public comment is saying on that. I'm not sure if we're necessarily trying to give some direction to the staff. I'm not sure if we're looking for consensus, but certainly any comments that commissioners can give on these various proposals would be nice. But I'm not sure. There's no vote for today. No, that's not agendized. So I want to try and keep it to a discussion and maybe some direction to staff.
Okay. Are there any areas of concern?
I mean, we had, I don't know their names, but they own a tractor company, and they have concerns, and I don't know how to, obviously, how to bridge those concerns with what this plan is presenting. And, if you come up with something creative, which planning often does, that would be probably helpful. But I also understand we have to meet the new regs. So,
Commission, sorry.
If he wants to, the owner wants to make a remark, I'm fine with that. But, I think that's why I asked the planner from the city. I wanted to really understand, like, the breadth of this plan and how it affects the neighborhood and the housing, and also, what everybody else's goals and policies are of their agencies. So, with that, I will pass, but if the gentleman from
I'll open public
Yes,
comment
okay,
again.
great.
I just want to kind of contain it a bit. Thank you. Anything else? Any other areas of concern?
So I do have one clarification. So where the lines fall, according to the current handbook, whether they're split a property or not, the line is the line. That's how I understand it from Mead and Hunt?
In terms of the implementation of the plan, yes, the line would be the line. Now, whether there is desire to move where the line is, that's a different matter. But what we've shown follows the typical dimensions of safety zones out of the handbook. And while these criteria also do consider noise, we've concluded that the noise impacts are really kind of consumed within the safety zone boundaries, and so that it accomplishes all the noise objectives for the most part.
And so I understand the only deviation then was on the southwest side of Zone 3, where current traffic patterns and stuff don't really use that area, that you moved that adjustment.
We've adjusted that, and indeed, from the Caltrans handbook, there's three basic sets of safety zones, which are the difference between those is how long the runway is. So we have taken the ones that's appropriate for this runway. The handbook describes them all as examples, not the only possibility, and encourages adjustment to reflect how aircraft fly at a particular airport. And so the angling of the the path to the south, based on what we understand of aircraft flight paths, matches the guidance that the handbook provides.
Anything else from commission at this time? Okay. Open it back up to public comment.
Brad Campbell, General Manager, Garten Tractor. Thank you for your concern. I mentioned this earlier, if there's any way that we cannot blend the future and current RPZ zones, we can still exist. That's all we have to do is not blend the zones. Most of our property will be in Zone B, like Eric said, which actually increases density and will allow us to continue there. That's all we have to do is not blend the RPZ zones, if that's possible.
Anything else from the public at this time?
Just really quick to address Commissioner's point regarding the overall city recommendations. It's 1 or 2, A through D. I was trying to get that to be pulled up on the screen here. But the agenda packet. 2A. Yeah, so 2I through 5, 2A, I through 5 is what the city's recommendations are. Yeah, sure.
And if I may add, the county is also in support of the same recommendations of 2A, I through V.
And let me just clarify that that is reflected in map 1, which shows the blue boundaries. And again, it does not include a blended runway protection zone. It includes the 5-degree offset of the southern zones, and it includes the urban overlays within the city and the county for Zone 3 to the southwest for the county.
Okay. Well, I think that's a presentation, by gosh and by golly. Matters from staff.
No matters at this time, but we're available for any questions you may have.
Matters from the commission. Nope, didn't see any minutes. Entertain a motion to adjourn.
So move.
Here a second?
I'll second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?